welcome to the last edition of HR Hot Topics for the 2023 calendar year. I'm your host, Jodi Schafer, and my aim is to make this the most informative 5 to 10 minutes of your month. As you can see behind me, it is the holiday time here. I've got the whole house decorated for Christmas, and I was trying to think about, topics that would make sense for this time of year. And I have one that is not all that glamorous, but because of timing makes a lot of sense. And that has to do with handbooks and a recent decision by the National Labor Relations Board that will affect many of the policies currently in your handbook. We actually just had our handbook template reviewed by legal counsel. It had been several years. We had some updates we knew we needed to make. But the biggest set of comments came in relation to policies that we had in our handbook forever. Code of conduct policies, policies around how employees can use social media and some of the electronic communication tools, policies around right to search, policies around non-solicitation, non-competes or moonlighting policies, things that were staples in handbooks for decades are now coming under scrutiny by the National Labor Relations Board. And so we had to go through and make some pretty significant adjustments to the wording in those policies in preparation for a handbook training that we have coming up this week. So I wanted to share some of that information with all of you. I'm going to share with you a few articles as well to further explain this and some sample policy language, because my guess is your policies were probably written similar to ours, and it was very broad, general language. If you think about an employee code of conduct policy, for example, we had language in there that required employees to behave civilly towards each other, to engage in teamwork and professional communication. And the NLRB thinks that all of that is now overly broad and that it might somehow chill an employee's ability to interact in protected activity. And protected activity, in the eyes of the National Labor Relations Board, is discussing anything with another employee that has to do with wages, hours, or working conditions. And so the thought here is that an employee might be discussing their wages and their benefits in a negative light, and the National Labor Relations Act, which covers both unionized and non-unionized employers, would allow employees to do exactly that. But you, the employer, might think that that is unprofessional language and therefore try to prohibit it under your code of conduct policy. And this August 2nd ruling from the National Labor Relations Board would say, employers, you can't do that now. Your language cannot be so overly broad. In other words, you can't prohibit an employee's right to complain about things. That's language from Cliff Hammond, who's our employment law attorney with Foster Swift, and he gave a webinar recently, and that was kind of the big takeaway. The National Labor Relations Board wants to grant a workplace where employees are free to complain about almost anything. And any language that you have in your handbook that would stifle that, the National Labor Relations Board may deem that to be invalid language. And so when we went through our handbook audit, we had to look at some of these long-standing policies and get much more specific. So I'm going to read you one example here. This was sample language that was put forth in a recent SHRM article, which I will attach to here in the email message below. But this is sample language that an attorney drafted as a revised code of conduct policy that would be permissible under the new National Labor Relations Board ruling. So instead of just simply saying, be civil, be a professional in the workplace, have good communication and good teamwork, it has to be much more specific. And it should read something like this. If you decide to offer complaints or criticism, avoid using statements, social media posts, photographs, videos, or audio that reasonably could be viewed as unlawful, knowingly or recklessly false, or constitutes unlawful harassment of one or more coworkers. And then it goes on to give examples of what those types of comments might be. So instead of just simply saying, be a professional, be an adult in the workplace, you have to get much more specific about what that means. So if you have not looked at your handbook recently, or you've been making small updates to it, like for example in June when the Crown Act came out, which expanded the definition of race to include hair texture and protected hairstyles, you might have gone into your EEO policy in your handbook and expanded that definition of race. When sex was expanded to include sexual orientation and gender identity, hopefully you went into your handbook policy again in the EEO section and you expanded that definition of sex. So you might have been doing like periodic updates all along. I know last month when I was talking about artificial intelligence, I encouraged all of you to take a look at some of your internal policies. My guess is most of you don't have any around that, and to potentially draft an AI policy and put it in your handbook. So a few things like that throughout the year, but this NLRB ruling from August 2nd really kind of casts a different light on many of your standard policies that you've had in place for decades. And so I want to make sure that as we enter 2024 and kind of this new landscape here, that you're not inadvertently putting yourself at risk because of some of the language you are using. Now, things like confidentiality policies, the non-solicitation policy, the non-disparagement policy, you might have non-compete language, or you might have language if an employee is moonlighting in a second job and how that's supposed to work with your job. If you have policies like that the National Labor Relations Board may look unfavorably upon if they were in your handbook, you do have the ability to create a separate standalone document that has those policies in it that the employee would sign separate from the handbook. In other words, they don't want you to lump everything in but the kitchen sink anymore in one document. So we actually worked with Cliff to create that template, that standalone document. I think it's got confidentiality, I think it has non-disparagement, and I think there's some potential non-compete language in there that clients can customize according to their needs. But it is a separate document that the employee has to sign. So that way it doesn't invalidate all the other policies in your handbook if it were to come under scrutiny, because they are separate. So that's one good, piece of advice here moving forward. Again, legal counsel would be helpful in this case, depending on your industry and how many changes you may need to make. But if your handbook isn't something that you've had reviewed in quite some time, 2024 would be a good time to do that. Whether it's Q1, Q2, I don't see this ruling going anywhere. There's some articles that suggest it will probably be appealed, but that could take months or even years. And for those of you that are not familiar with the National Labor Relations Board, excuse me, it is a board that is appointed by whichever party is in charge of our country. And so the opinions of that board and how regulations are viewed by that board tend to swing from left to right over time. So, I don't think that it's a four-alarm fire situation, but it's definitely something to watch. And this National Labor Relations Board will be in place for at least long enough, right, that you've got some risk and exposure if you don't take a look at some of those policies. So HRM can help you with that. Handbook editing and handbook development is a service that we provide. Certainly your legal counsel could take a look at what you have in place. But I just wanted to leave you with some of that good information as you're looking into 2024. So with that, I will wish you happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and all the rest, right, from our team to yours. We hope that you had a wonderful 2023, and we're really excited to see what 2024 will bring. So join us again in January.